Tansi, Danica Berard Nisi Kasson. My name is Danica, and I am currently recording this project on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Katzie and Kwantlen First Nations. I myself am Métis on my father's side. I am a citizen of Métis Nation, British Columbia, and my family comes from the St. Boniface settlement in Manitoba. Some of my family names are Berard, Lajemoldia, Champagne, and Descharmes. I'm very excited to explore a new side of Métis history today and talk about Gabriel Dumont, one of my people's most significant leaders. The late 19th century was a very challenging time for First Nations and Métis people on the prairies as they experienced increasing land encroachment, food scarcity, as well as government surveillance and control. As a result of these hardships, Métis leaders came together. They joined forces with the First Nations to fight the federal government, who was directly responsible for their suffering in what is now referred to as the Northwest Resistance. Today, I will explore the historical significance of the Métis leader, Gabriel Dumont. Dumont was a hunt chief, political and military leader for the Métis and a staunch defender of Métis sovereignty, culture, and land rights. Dumont was a key figure to Métis resistance against colonialism in the 19th century. Today, I will explore the history of Gabriel Dumont and the historical context of his work, arguing that Dumont is a significant figure in Canadian history as a leader within the Northwest Resistance and beyond, who selflessly defended Indigenous rights and resisted colonialism. To start, I will be giving a historical context of who the Métis were and the conditions that led Dumont to his position of leadership within the Métis Nation. The Métis emerged from the Red River settlement in Manitoba during the early 19th century. They are a distinct Indigenous group that formed from intermarriages between First Nations women from the Cree and Ojibwe nations and French and Scottish fur traders. Métis culture is unique and derived from its blend of European and Indigenous influences. The Métis lived off the land, and the buffalo were essential to their subsistence, lifestyle, and culture. Confederation times introduced many new struggles for the Métis as they experienced increasing impacts from settler colonialism and political exclusion. The Red River Resistance occurred between 1869 and 70, shortly after Confederation. Many Métis left Manitoba and continued west due to land dispossession, failure of the scrip system, increasing Anglophone settlement, and fears of government restrictions. Unfortunately, these struggles would follow them across the prairies. Around 1870, the Métis were forced to transition from their semi-nomadic buffalo hunting and traditional lifestyles to a more agricultural settlement lifestyle culture as a result of land encroachment and declining buffalo populations. Once the buffalo were entirely gone, the Métis formed their own localized government and went on delegations to Ottawa. John A. Macdonald's government began surveying the area and eventually established the Northwest Mounted Police in the area, disregarding the Métis Constitution and land claims to the region. The Métis transitioned from diplomatic negotiations to more direct resistance very quickly after seeing no progress, ultimately resulting in the Northwest Resistance, where Dumont would prove himself to be a selfless leader. Dumont was born into a large first-generation Métis family. Dumont's mother was Sarkri, and his father was French-Canadian, and they had 11 children in total. Dumont's family worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, trading pemmican and fur. Dumont became a skilled horseback rider, rifleman, and archer at a very young age, and was raised in the diplomatic tradition of the Northern Plains people. Dumont also learned to hunt buffalo as a child, and many of those teachings would guide his work throughout his life. Dumont spoke many languages, including Michif, French, Crow, Blackfoot, Cree, and Sioux, many of which he learned through trading. Dumont became a warrior at a very young age, fighting his first battle against the Dakota when he was just 13 years old. His involvement in battles increased his involvement with Métis politics as well, as Dumont supported treaty negotiations between Métis, Dakota, and Blackfoot. Dumont was elected as hunt chief in 1863 in Saskatchewan and remained in that position until the buffalo were essentially gone. Dumont slowly shifted his work, becoming a farmer, storekeeper, road contractor, and ferryman as a result. Dumont's political career emerged from the decline of the buffalo as he became the elected president of the Council of St. Laurent in 1873, and their government followed the same governing system the Métis had used during the buffalo hunt. At the same time, Dumont constantly worked hard to strengthen relations between Métis and First Nations through his alliance building with the Sioux and Blackfoot, and his overall defense of Indigenous rights to land on the prairies. In the early 1880s, Dumont and his government went on diplomatic trips to Ottawa to try and have their land claims be formally recognized, and after no success, Dumont led a group to Montana to seek Louis Riel's advice and assistance. In 1885, after no response or attempt at negotiation by the federal government, Dumont and his government decided to form their own army that Dumont would lead on the ground. Riel became the government's president, and Dumont became his left-hand man, critical in political and military decisions. The Métis and First Nations were at a critical point where their land was being lost, the buffalo were gone, and the Canadian government had instilled increasing surveillance and rule on the prairies, which had not only completely disrupted their ways of life, but also put many Indigenous peoples in very vulnerable positions, leading them to the Northwest Resistance. Dumont traveled to reserves and kept close communication with chiefs to work towards a common cause, and many First Nations leaders and warriors joined his army or made their own armies in support of the Northwest Resistance. Dumont was the Métis Army's military leader in the Northwest Resistance, leading his people strategically following Riel's orders of never being the first to fire. The Northwest Resistance officially began when Dumont's army met with the Northwest Mounted Police at Duck Lake. Dumont followed Riel's decision to have a peaceful approach to their fight, only using violence in defense when needed. With that said, the Northwest Mounted Police shot and killed Dumont's brother and an unarmed Cree man unprovoked, so Dumont's army fired back in defense. Dumont stated in his personal reflection that his intention was only to injure the enemy to prevent them from killing himself or his army. Dumont would only kill when he had no other choice, and when he did, he felt deep guilt, as he wrote about in his personal reflections of the resistance. Unfortunately, during the Battle of Batoche, Dumont's army had substantially fewer weapons and ammunition than the Canadian government. The Métis ran out of ammunition, and ultimately their settlement fell. Dumont did not surrender himself to Canadian authorities as he knew his fate would be death, which would ultimately prevent himself from continuing this fight to defend his nation, as he would continue to do throughout the rest of his life. Dumont was forced to flee to America, and the American government recognized Riel's unjustifiable fate, which would likely be the same for Dumont. Dumont joined Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show in the United States for a period while seeking refuge in the United States. He then returned to advocacy and resistance, spending years touring the east coast of Canada and America, advocating for First Nations peoples on the prairies, the starvation they were experiencing, and both Métis and First Nations land claims. Dumont also returned specifically to Quebec to speak to French Canadians who supported the Métis to gain further solidarity. Dumont eventually made his way back to Saskatchewan and rejected the agricultural lifestyle and chose to live nomadically off the land, hunting and fishing until he passed away in 1906. As you can probably see, Dumont's significance shines in many ways. Dumont is often referred to as a visionary for recognizing the decline of the buffalo and the increased settlement for agriculture as a threat to Métis life within the prairies early on. It is also clear that Dumont was an advocate for Indigenous peoples' rights as well as a diplomatic and military leader in resistance to colonialism. Interestingly, Dumont was even highly regarded by the Canadian government as a very successful military leader and someone who embodied late Victorian masculinity under the colonial lens. With that said, Dumont is also highly regarded as a hero by the Métis for his overall selflessness and empathy guiding his work. Dumont always put his people first. For example, throughout the Northwest Resistance, Dumont faced many personal losses and attacks, but always persevered. Despite losing his own brother and sustaining a shot to the side of his skull which made him bleed profusely, Dumont continued to lead the Métis into battle at Duck Lake. Not only did Dumont care deeply about his people's future in terms of the big picture, but he also cared for every individual in his community he could. For instance, after the Métis lost in Batoche, Dumont stayed near the settlement for days afterwards to help. Dumont would travel back into Batoche and to a camp nearby to retrieve supplies such as blankets and food for the sick and injured. Dumont also sourced remaining hides and made moccasins for the children who were shoeless. Despite being warned it was very risky and having passed a few Northwest Mounted Police who tried to kill him en route, Dumont stated that he was afraid of nothing. Dumont also always gave his first kill while hunting away to a family in need, and when he left for Montana, he only took a few pounds of cake to feed himself for the whole journey, reflecting on how he always put his community first. In Dumont's personal account of the Northwest Resistance, he also spoke about the fallen soldiers in many battles, remembering many of those who fought alongside him. Dumont always protected and honored the lives of the dead in battle. For instance, in the battle at Duck Lake, Dumont protected and prayed for the fallen soldiers. He also ensured that the bodies of the English soldiers were protected and that their officials were able to retrieve them safely. Dumont was also a defender of Métis culture in many ways, as he informed his decisions based on his experiences and knowledge in the buffalo hunt. Dumont's lifelong commitment to defending Indigenous rights and resisting colonialism, always putting his people first, makes him a significant historical Canadian figure. Dumont is one of the Métis Nation's most significant leaders who fought relentlessly for his people and land. He defended Métis rights to self-determination and land claims through diplomacy and military approaches. Dumont led the Métis in battle, and despite sustaining extreme injuries and many personal losses, he selflessly continued to fight. He also risked being arrested by the Northwest Mounted Police and facing treason charges to stay back and help his people as much as possible. Dumont is a prime example of a Canadian hero who should continue to be celebrated and commemorated to this day, as his legacy of Métis resistance, resilience, and diplomacy continues to influence our nation even over 100 years later. Anyways, thank you so much for listening today. I hope you were able to learn a little bit about Métis history and about Gabriel Dumont. Merci, go Bob Demiwa.